Nicolas Moll, Doctor of Comparative History, to present his research that is dealing with memories that are not coming from such a long history. He will be talking about protests in Bosnia and Herzegovina and 1992-1995 war legacies, getting out of the war zone. Dr. Moll, please join us.
Actually, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but two short video extracts which I will show during my presentation, but just a bit long. So, thanks. Good morning, everybody. So I'm living since 7 years in Sarajevo. I don't know if this makes me a pravi Bosanac, but anyway. So I'm a historian, but I'm, as a historian, also very much interested in what is going on right now. That's also one of the reasons why I'm very much interested in the protests which are ongoing since February in Bosnia and Herzegovina in different towns. And in my presentation I want to discuss the question to what extent do these protests represent something new in the attitudes in Bosnia and Herzegovina towards the 92-95 war. So now we all remember that after the 7th of February, when the day of the violent protests, the protests have been very much associated with the 92-95 war. For example, in Sarajevo, for many who had lived through the siege, the violence awakened traumatic souvenirs and raised fears, as one person said, that such dark days might be coming again. The burning buildings were especially associated with the attack of 2nd May 92, and citizens expressed their sadness or irritation to see the presidential building burning, which had survived the siege and which was for them a symbol of the resistance of this time. So these references to 92-95 were also used by different politicians and media in order to disqualify the protesters. In the Federation, different politicians qualified the protesters directly as Chetniks and put them in continuity with those who had aimed to destroy the state in 92. And in the Republika Srpska, politicians and media also mobilized souvenirs of 92-95, pretending that the protesters' aim was to return to 92 and to destroy the Republika Srpska. So in a certain way, all these references and uses of the 92-95 war were not unusual. Evoking war analogies and using arguments related to the war is something which is very common in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It illustrates the omnipresence of the war memories in the country, also 20 years after the official end of the war. And it illustrates what many observers are stating, that for many reasons Bosnia and Herzegovina has not managed to move on, that it is still stuck in the past, or in a situation which you might qualify as neither peace nor war, saying that the war in 95 has ended militarily, but not psychologically. In short, that Bosnia and Herzegovina has not managed to get out of the war zone. And in this context, it is indeed not surprising that during the violent protests of February 7, the war analogy was so widely used. Now, concerning the relation between the protests and the war, we could stop the analysis here, but then we would miss a crucial point. Because actually the protests have not only provoked the usual war reference reflexes, they seem also to have articulated something different in the public sphere in relation to the war. A reaction which we could see as a sort of rejection of this omnipresent war focus. The first significant hint for this was this popular 51-second video, which was made the 8th of February, where in front of a burned presidency building, an older man expresses all his anger about all the corrupt politicians. So you may remember this video. and I will show it. And what I find extremely revealing for our topic is that at the beginning there's another man speaking, looking at the destroyed building and saying how sad he is, because he defended this building during the siege, and then comes the older man, tells, I'm enjoying to see this building, and explains why. So we'll now see this video, and look especially what the first man says, then how he reacts when the older man interferes, and then how the older man continues. Your help is always welcome.
Dobro, stvarno, ja sam 4 godine branio sve ovo sad tužno i gledat. Šta je fino vidio? Ovo, kako će biti fino vidio?
Pa tu u njem se mrtačke gaće kroje.
Je li paljenje rješenje izlaz iz problema?
Ovo su trebalo blokirati i ne dati izaći nikom. Potušta, a ne paliti. I kriminalce potamaniti. Drugčijeg ne ima izbora, pa 20 godina nas dave i tuše. Ne daju nam. Moji 28 penzija Špirić ima platu. A ministar financija 24. Samo plati. Gdje je godišnji regres? Gdje mu je topli obruk? Ima 2,5 moje penzije toplog obruka. A ja radio 40 godina, 7 mjeseci, 18 dana i 304 marke penzije. Pa to je žalostno.
So for our topic, I find this video very interesting for 3 reasons. First, it shows 2 totally different attitudes towards the past and the conflict between these 2 attitudes. The first attitude, where the perspective is turned to the past, which relates the building to the war events, in opposition to a second attitude, which basically says, I don't care about the war right now. That's not what this is about. This is about corrupt politicians which are ruining our life. Secondly, what is very interesting is also the absolute disbelief of the first man when he hears the older man saying, I'm enjoying it. Obviously, he doesn't expect at all such a discourse he probably never had ever imagined that he could hear. And thirdly, the video shows also the symbolic victory of the older man and of his attitude. He makes the talking, he gets all the attention of the camera, and the first man does not appear in the video anymore. And I think that the fact that the video became so popular and so successful in the social media shows that obviously it hit some nerve, gave voice to something which was not articulated like this before, and what now, with the protests, became much more articulated in the public sphere. A discourse which is not focusing on the war, and which is even rejecting this attitude to see everything in relation to the war. In short, a discourse which sees the presidency building primarily not as a symbol of resistance, but as a symbol of corruption, and which says this loudly. So this video has been for me a starting point to reflect more on the relation between the protests and the war, and to look to what extent the protests are articulating a new approach towards the 92-95 war memories. And after the following the protests now for several weeks, I will clearly say yes, they are articulating a new public approach towards the war, even if they do it more implicitly than explicitly. And they do it especially because they do not explicitly talk about the war, but about other issues, about social issues, about social justice and injustice, about criminal privatizations and corrupt political elites, about how to lead a normal life, about how to practice democracy, etc. In brief, they are mainly about the present and the future, and how to improve the life of the people, and not about the question who is responsible for the war, who has committed the most crimes, and why Satan is wrong. By doing so, the protests have indeed articulated a new public discourse, also in relation with the war past, which doesn't put this past in the center, and which rejects also certain war legacies, for example, to bring everything back to the war, and also to see everything through the ethnic lens. In that sense, I think the video with the grandpa is a quite good summary of the protest general discourse about the war and its legacies. Now, when I saw this grandpa video, it made me immediately think of one scene in a fiction movie, which I find one of the most interesting movies on the war and the war consequences of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this is the movie Belvedere from Ahmed Imamovic from 2011. I don't know who has seen from you this movie? Some of you, but not the majority. So for those who haven't seen it, it's the story 15 years after the war of a woman and her sister whose husbands have been killed in Srebrenica and whose remains have not been found, and how these women try to cope with that terrible situation. And it is also the story about the 15-year-old Adnan, the son of one of the two women, who tries to get out from this oppressing war atmosphere in which he has grown up, and who manages to be chosen to participate in a TV reality show in Belgrade. One reason why I find this film so interesting is because it was the first time that I saw that a fiction movie gave a large face to an attitude which exists in the society in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but which you don't find often publicly articulated, and which is what I would summarize as the fed-up attitude. The attitude to say, I'm fed up with this constant talking about the war, fed up to be stuck in the past. And there's one key moment in the movie where the boy announces to his mother that he has been selected to go to Belgrade, and her mother and aunt react very negatively, saying, you can't go to Belgrade, the Serbs have killed your father. What leads to a clash between the mother and her son. So I'll show this short scene, which is 1.5 minutes. So again, technical assistance. To 27, exactly. 700.
Mrtve, ne mrtve, ja za 3 dana moram biti u Beogradu.
Kako ne misliš na to?
Srbije, Beograd.
Dobro, iz Beograda može doći.
A vježbu, ja ti popiš, počitaj 3 dana.
So when he gets the letter where he learns that he's accepted to participate in this Big Brother show in Belgrade.
Idem u velikog bratka. Idem u velikog bratka. Veliki bratko, hvala na pozivu. Ja ti obećavam da nisi pogriješio što si pozvao jednog pravog pravcatog Bosanca.
A u šta ideš, šta kažeš?
Pa, u Beograd, primili me reality show, veliki bratko, 100.000 € pobjedniku.
Od Srba pare da uzmeš. Da naplatiš što ste ubili oca, ja? Samo preko mene, mrtve.
Mrtve, ne mrtve, ja za 3 dana moram biti u Beogradu.
Adno nas ti da slušaš šta tako kaže. Babo bi te svojom rukom ubio. Kako ne misliš na to? Sve nam živo pobili ti s njima u svirku pjesmu.
Veliki bratko, oprosti, one ne znaju šta govorim. Adnan Maslo i njegova harmonika stižu tačno u 5 do 5.
Čuješ se?
Skloni ruke, mama, skloni ruke, dosta ba više. Pa dosta jebote, 15 godina me jebete u zdrav mozak. Pa hoću da živim, popustite me više. Ne mogu tih vaših ratnih priča, dosta mi je, gotovo, prošlo. Hoću da živim.
So now the first video we saw with the older man made me think about this scene in Belvedere, because there's one similarity, the clash between an attitude which is focused on the past and an attitude which is fed up with that. At the same time, there are also obvious and important differences between both scenes. The two situations and their backgrounds are not the same. And especially, even if both scenes give voice to I'm a fed up attitude, it's not necessarily the same attitude, as you can be fed up in different ways. In general, I think we can distinguish at least two fed up attitudes related to the war. One is to be fed up with the war memories in general, you just don't want to hear about them anymore. Another one is to be fed up not with the war memories in general, but with the omnipresent focus on them, or with the dominating ways they are dealt with. Furthermore, the same person can be fed up with the war and simultaneously have the need and will to talk about the war. I have often met persons who tell me, I don't want to talk about the war, and then 2 minutes later they start to talk about it. What might appear contradictory, but contradictions are here completely normal and an illustration of the difficulties to deal with your own war legacies and memories. So I would say that we can certainly find a fed-up attitude within the protests today, also in relation to the war, but it is not the attitude of the boy from Belvedere movie who doesn't want to hear about the war at all and tries to escape from the reality, ironically by going to a reality show. But with the protest, it is more a fed-up attitude with the constant focus on the war and also the dominating political and social use of the war memories. And it is a fed-up attitude which does not only say dosta, but develops an alternative discourse and which doesn't try to escape from the current situation, but which tries to change the current situation. What is an important difference? Also, even if the protests do not focus on the war, this does not mean that war-related topics are not present at all, or that the protesters don't care about it. In some plenums have been discussed and also partially voted requests concerning the social care for war veterans and civilians war victims. Among the protesters are many war veterans, even if most war veteran associations in the Federation have not joined the protests. Among these war veterans and also other protests, we will find many individual and different opinions and feelings towards the war and also about Dayton. But what I find interesting, that they all nevertheless agree that these protests are not the place to focus on the war. Now, this decision not to focus on the war and also on Dayton is certainly a strategical choice, knowing that focusing on this would create huge tensions. But it also expresses for many the conviction that there is a need to deal differently with the war, and also a rejection of a very frequent attitude to bring back all the existing problems in the country today to the war and to Dayton. I'll give two more small examples to illustrate that the protests have produced and are producing a public approach in relation with the war, which is different from the public discourses which are usually dominating. First, we all know that the war is a central reference in individual and public discourse about one's life. Terms as before the war, during the war, since the war, I made this and this. They are often used to describe one's own biography. Now, interestingly, the main time reference, which you hear all the time during the protest, is not since the war or after the war, but it is 20 years. Or since 20 years, the politicians are doing this, 20 years. So also in the video with the grandfather, he talks about 20 years. Of course, this refers to the war or to its end, but it doesn't say it explicitly. The discourse is not since the war, but since 20 years. What is a little difference, but I think a significant one, which illustrates also the will not to bring back everything to the war. Second example, the dealing with the lily flag during the protests. The lily flag, which is generally seen as the war flag, positively or negatively, and which has been quite visible at the beginning of the protests. But then, after tough internal discussions, the flag fastly disappeared from the protests, through that also sending a strong signal, this is not about the war, this is about something else. So we can say that the protests have articulated a new public discourse, but that also means that we can therefore see the protests as a contribution to get Bosnia and Herzegovina out of the war zone. This question raises, of course, other questions. What does it mean for a society to get out of the war? When does such a process start? When does it end, if it ever ends? A very basic definition for a society which starts to get out of the war could be to say it is a society which starts to focus more on the present and the future, and it is not predominantly focused on the war past. This does not necessarily mean to forget the past. Psychologists say that it is anyway impossible to forget or to get rid of a war trauma, that the trauma will never go away, but that the challenge is to learn to live with the war trauma in a way that you can reconstruct and move on with your life. This is valid for individuals, but we can transpose it in a certain way to post-war societies. The challenge for post-war societies is to find a constructive way to deal with its war traumas in order that these traumas are not dominating everything, or the challenge is to build a future without forgetting the past, but also without being hindered by the past to move forward. What is a very difficult process, and each society has to find its own way to handle this process. Now, how is the situation today in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Probably most here would agree that in the 20 years since the end of the combats, as we have said at the beginning, the society has globally not really moved on, that it is stuck in the past which is not addressed constructively in order to find a certain peace, but which is more used to defend certain political positions and to feed fears and divisions. So there are a lot of reasons to explain the permanence of this stuck-in-the-war feeling. One of them is the absence of economical and social development, which in other countries, as in Germany in the 1950s, has contributed to give to the society the feeling that it is moving forward. But the absence of economic development is only one factor. Another one is that there has been no real political and social will to get out of the war zone because of unwillingness for those for whom the current situation is profitable, or because of fear or apathy for others. In this context, I think the protest can be seen as a significant contribution to get out of this war zone, and this at least on two levels. On the one hand, for the protesters themselves. Many of those got the first time actively involved in public protest. Several said how this gave a new positive meaning to their life, becoming proactive instead of waiting that others resolve your problems. In a certain way, we could say that there has been for many a transition from a victim status to a citizen status, what includes also a victory over own war-related fears. One of the main explanations we have heard why there haven't been such protests before is that many people are afraid of instability, preferring a bad status quo to any risk of a new war. This fear has not necessarily disappeared, but those who are participating in the protests are obviously not blocked by it anymore, but can be seen as an important step in their individual way out of the war. But the protests can also be seen as a significant contribution in getting out of the war zone for the society in general, so not only for individuals. Because the protests have created a collective movement and a discourse which has strongly penetrated the public space. It is a discourse which is not shared everywhere, it is also criticized or rejected, but nevertheless it has brought in the political and social arena a voice and an approach which was not present in this way before, and which clearly says we want to build another society, including also the message we cannot relate everything to the war, and also that war-related questions have to be addressed, yes, but also that we need other approaches to deal with our daily problems and also with our past. Now, to finish, it is of course too early to tell now whether the protests will have a lasting impact. And will they, for example, be able to change the dominating situation and atmosphere of being stuck in the past without constructively dealing with this past? I know that it is common to be very pessimistic about everything concerning Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this pessimistic view is also articulated in the movie Belvedere, which I mentioned before. Adnan, the boy who tried to escape the war past and went to a reality show in Belgrade, has finally to leave the show and is brought back to the war reality. I will not tell the whole story for those who would like to see the movie, but anyway, the film ends tragically and seems to indicate that it is impossible to escape the past, to find a way out of it. So I like very much this movie, but this does not mean that I think that the end of the movie is also the destiny of a society in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I certainly don't think that Bosnia and Herzegovina is condemned to be stuck in the past. Concerning the protests, we can of course argue that they have a limited outreach, because they are limited to a certain number of citizens, and also to certain towns, and they are especially widely absent from the Republika Srpska. The protests are also certainly not free from contradictions, and the dynamics is not the same today as during the first weeks. But nevertheless, the protests have already produced a future-oriented collective momentum, and of course getting out of the war, here or elsewhere, is a struggle which takes time, is a process of small steps and setbacks with people disagreeing and arguing how to do things or not to do things. To quote one of the early definitions of the protest, which I think remains one of the best definitions, by Damir Asenijević, who wrote, "The people stood up against a shapeless future to take the future into their own hands and to create new possibilities." I agree that the protests are showing new possibilities for the society in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this concerns also the attitude towards the past. Regarding the 92-95 war, the protests have not necessarily defined what should be the place of the war within the future they want to build. But by rejecting some of the dominating uses of the war memories, they have opened the space also for discussion what are appropriate ways to address the past and to get the country out of this war zone. And this discussion, how to get out of a war zone, is an essential part of such a process, and a discussion which needs to be continued and continued, hopefully also through this symposium. So thank you very much for your attention, and if there's time for questions, of course, or comments or critics, I'll of course be glad to hear them. Thank you.